I went to the bank to close my late husband's account. I thought there might be a few $100s left in it, maybe enough to pay a utility bill or buy groceries for the week. Instead, the bank manager led me into a private office, turned his computer screen toward me, and showed me an account balance of more than $41 million. I had been married to my husband for 42 years, and in that moment, I realized there was a part of his life I knew absolutely nothing about. Before I tell you what happened, I have a question. Have you ever discovered something about a person you loved that completely changed the way you saw them? If you have, let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading them. And if you like these kinds of stories, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps more than you know. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 67 years old, and until recently, I thought my life was mostly figured out. I live in a small town outside Louisville, Kentucky. The house I live in isn't fancy, but it's home. My husband Thomas and I raised our 2 children there. We celebrated birthdays there. We hosted Christmas dinners there. We spent countless evenings sitting on the back porch talking about everything and nothing at the same time. Thomas passed away 18 months before all of this happened. Even now, it feels strange saying those words. When you've spent more than 40 years with someone, they become woven into every part of your daily life. You don't just miss the big things after they're gone. You miss the small things. The sound of them walking through the house. The way they clear their throat before speaking. The familiar routine of having another person sitting across from you at breakfast. The first year after Thomas died felt like a long list of responsibilities. There were insurance forms to complete, accounts to settle, paperwork to organize, and legal documents to sign. Some days, I felt like I spent more time talking to lawyers and accountants than I did talking to my own family. Thankfully, everything seemed straightforward. Thomas had worked as a regional sales manager for most of his career. We were comfortable, but we weren't wealthy. We had retirement accounts, some savings, a life insurance policy, and the house. Nothing unusual appeared during probate. Nothing suggested hidden assets, secret businesses, or forgotten fortunes. That's why I didn't think much about the first letter. It arrived about 6 months after the estate was settled. The envelope came from a bank in Lexington. Since I didn't recognize the bank's name, I assumed it was advertising and tossed it into a kitchen drawer. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. Then another. The third one finally caught my attention because it referenced an inactive account connected to Thomas. At first, I assumed it was some kind of mistake. After all, we had already dealt with his accounts. Everything had been reviewed by attorneys. Everything had been documented. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I called the number listed on the letter. The woman who answered was polite but careful. She confirmed that an account existed and explained that I would need to visit the branch in person with identification and estate paperwork. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Nothing about it seemed important. The following Tuesday, I drove to Lexington. The branch looked exactly like every other bank I've ever visited. There were customers waiting in line, people sitting with financial advisors, and employees moving back and forth behind the counters. The place felt ordinary in every possible way. I approached the teller and explained why I was there. She asked for my identification and began reviewing the records. At first, everything seemed normal. Then she stopped typing. I remember watching her expression change. She looked at her screen, looked at me, and then looked back at the screen again. A few moments later, she excused herself and disappeared through a door behind the counter. I assumed there was some paperwork issue. Maybe they needed additional documents. Maybe the account was already closed. Maybe Thomas had used a different address. I certainly wasn't expecting what happened next. A man in a navy suit approached me and introduced himself as Daniel Whitmore, the branch manager. He asked if I would be willing to join him in his office. The request immediately made me nervous. As soon as we sat down, he asked a question that confused me. "Mrs. Sullivan, when was the last time you reviewed this account?" I told him I had never reviewed it because I didn't know it existed. He nodded slowly. Then he turned his computer monitor toward me. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I was looking at someone else's information. The number on the screen was so large that my mind refused to process it. I checked the account holder's name, Thomas Sullivan. Then I checked it again. Then I looked at the balance. $41,386,214. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because the number was impossible. Thomas and I spent years discussing budgets. We postponed vacations when money was tight. We drove used vehicles. We compared prices at grocery stores. We lived like ordinary middle-class people because, as far as I knew, that's exactly what we were. I asked whether there had been some mistake. Mr. Whitmore assured me there had not. The account belonged to Thomas. The records were accurate. The documentation was complete. Then he showed me something that made even less sense. The account wasn't new. It had existed for nearly 15 years. 15 years. I sat there trying to make sense of what I was hearing. 15 years earlier, our daughter Emily was planning her wedding. Our son David had just bought his first home. Thomas and I were talking about retirement and worrying about health care costs. Meanwhile, according to the bank records, he had somehow accumulated more than $41 million. I asked where the money came from. Mr. Whitmore opened another screen and showed me the transaction history. Most of the major deposits came from the same source, a company called Blackstone Ridge Holdings. The name meant nothing to me. I had never heard Thomas mention it. Not once. Before I left, the manager printed copies of the account records and placed them inside a folder. I thanked him, walked back to my car, and sat behind the steering wheel for almost 20 minutes without starting the engine. The money was shocking. But that wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was realizing that, after 42 years of marriage, there was an entire part of my husband's life that had somehow remained hidden from me. And for the first time since his death, I found myself wondering whether Thomas had been keeping secrets for a reason. I barely remember the drive home from the bank. The folder containing the account records sat on the passenger seat beside me, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Every time I glanced at it, I found myself questioning whether what I had seen was real. The number on that computer screen simply didn't fit with the life Thomas and I had lived together. We were careful with money. We planned purchases. We discussed expenses. We worried about retirement the same way most people our age did. Nothing about our life suggested that my husband had access to more than $41 million. When I arrived home, I carried the folder into the kitchen and placed it on the table. For nearly 15 minutes, I simply sat there looking at it. Part of me hoped I had misunderstood something at the bank. Another part hoped the records would provide an explanation that made everything feel reasonable again. Eventually, I opened the folder and began reading. The documents confirmed everything the manager had shown me. The account belonged to Thomas. The balance was accurate. The account had existed for nearly 15 years. Most importantly, the transaction history showed that the majority of the deposits came from a company called Blackstone Ridge Holdings. I kept reading the name, hoping it would trigger some memory, but it didn't. I had never heard Thomas mention it. I couldn't remember seeing the name on tax documents, business records, or anything else connected to our finances. As the afternoon went on, I found myself becoming less focused on the money and more focused on the secrecy. The account was certainly shocking, but what truly bothered me was the realization that Thomas had maintained something this significant without ever discussing it with me. After 42 years of marriage, I believed there were very few surprises left between us. The existence of that account suggested I had been wrong. Later that evening, I called my son David. If anyone might know something I didn't, it would be him. Thomas and David had always shared a close relationship. They spent years fishing together, working on projects around the house together, and talking for hours whenever they got the chance. If Thomas had confided in anyone, I thought there was a possibility it might have been David. The conversation didn't provide any answers. In fact, David sounded just as confused as I was. We spent nearly half an hour discussing possible explanations, but none of them made sense. We considered whether Thomas might have inherited money from a distant relative, invested in a company that became unexpectedly successful, or quietly sold some valuable asset without mentioning it. Every theory seemed less believable than the last. Before ending the call, David asked me to send him copies of the account records. I agreed, and after we hung up, I emailed everything the bank had provided. A few minutes later, he called back. He had noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to during my first review of the documents. The account hadn't simply received deposits from Blackstone Ridge Holdings. According to the records, Thomas appeared to have ownership rights connected to the company. That observation immediately caught my attention. I reopened the folder and looked more carefully. David was right. Several documents referred to Thomas as a beneficiary and founding partner. The language was technical and difficult to follow, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Thomas wasn't merely receiving money from Blackstone Ridge Holdings. He had some direct connection to it. That realization made sleep almost impossible that night. Around midnight, I found myself walking into Thomas's old office. Since his death, I had done very little in that room beyond dusting and occasional cleaning. Most things remained exactly where he left them. His books still filled the shelves, family photographs still sat on his desk, and several framed certificates remained hanging on the wall. Standing there, I found myself wondering how much of the man I loved I had actually understood. I began looking through his desk, not because I expected to find answers, but because I didn't know what else to do. The first few drawers contained exactly what I expected. There were tax records, insurance documents, receipts, manuals for old appliances, and the ordinary collection of paperwork most people accumulate over the years. Nothing seemed unusual. As I continued searching, I noticed that one drawer wasn't sitting properly in its track. The detail caught my attention because Thomas was meticulous about keeping things organized. After removing the drawer completely, I discovered a small brass key attached beneath it with a strip of old tape. Finding it immediately raised questions. Thomas wasn't the kind of person who hid objects without a reason. Attached to the key was a paper tag. Written on it in his handwriting were the words File Cabinet B. The label confused me because, as far as I knew, we only owned one filing cabinet. The next hour was spent searching the house and garage. Eventually, I noticed a narrow door partially hidden behind storage shelves in the garage. I had lived in that house for more than 30 years, yet I couldn't remember ever opening it. When I moved the shelves aside and stepped through the doorway, I found a small storage room containing a gray metal filing cabinet. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Every one of them was labeled and arranged with the same careful attention Thomas brought to everything else in his life. The first folder I opened carried a name I now knew very well: Blackstone Ridge Holdings. I carried the folder back into the kitchen and began reading. Within a few minutes, I learned something that completely changed my understanding of the account. Blackstone Ridge Holdings wasn't a bank or investment fund. According to the documents in front of me, it was a private company that Thomas had helped establish many years earlier. His name appeared alongside several other founding partners, including a man named Richard Kane. At the time, Richard Kane was simply another unfamiliar name on a page. I had no idea who he was, how important he would become, or why Thomas had spent years preserving records connected to him. All I knew was that every answer I found seemed to create even more questions, and for the first time since leaving the bank, I had the feeling that the money itself might not be the biggest secret my husband had left behind. The next morning, I woke up with the same feeling I had gone to bed with. The questions were still there, and if anything, they seemed larger than they had the day before. Discovering that Thomas had helped establish Blackstone Ridge Holdings explained where the money came from, but it didn't explain why he kept the company hidden from me for so many years. After breakfast, I returned to the filing cabinet in the garage. The folder I had taken into the house the night before was only one of dozens. Most were organized by year, while others were labeled with project names, property acquisitions, and business partners. Thomas had always been organized, but this was something else entirely. It felt less like ordinary record keeping and more like someone preserving a history they expected another person to eventually review. I spent most of the morning reading. At first, the documents painted a fairly ordinary picture. Blackstone Ridge Holdings appeared to be a private investment company that focused on commercial real estate. The founders purchased warehouses, office buildings, industrial properties, and undeveloped land throughout Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. Many of the investments were successful. Some were not. Nothing about the early records suggested anything unusual. What surprised me most was Thomas's role in the company. According to the documents, he wasn't a minor investor. He was involved from the beginning. His signature appeared on partnership agreements, property purchases, and meeting records stretching back more than a decade. Yet despite all of that, he continued living exactly the same life I had always known. Around noon, I found a photograph clipped to the inside of one folder. The picture showed 4 people standing together at what looked like a company event. One of them was Thomas. The others were individuals I had never met. On the back of the photograph, someone had written their names: Richard Kane, Walter Brooks, Rebecca Lawson, Thomas Sullivan. I studied the photograph for several minutes. Richard Kane immediately stood out because he appeared repeatedly throughout the records. His name was on contracts, emails, and company correspondence. The more I read, the more obvious it became that Richard wasn't simply another founder. He seemed to be the driving force behind many of the company's major decisions. Later that afternoon, I came across something that made me stop reading entirely. Tucked inside one of the folders was a printed email exchange between Thomas and Richard. The conversation began normally enough. They were discussing one of the company's development projects and reviewing financial projections. Then the tone changed. Thomas started asking questions about several transfers that appeared in company records. The questions were specific. Where did the money go? Why was it routed through multiple companies? Why were certain transactions missing supporting documentation? Richard's responses were brief and dismissive. He repeatedly told Thomas not to worry about it and insisted everything had been reviewed properly. The final email in the chain was dated less than 2 years before Thomas's death. I remember reading it several times because of how different it felt from everything else. Richard wrote that Thomas needed to stop digging into matters that didn't concern him. He went on to say that constantly revisiting old transactions would only create problems for everyone involved. The wording bothered me. It wasn't openly threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. More importantly, it didn't sound like 2 business partners discussing routine accounting issues. It sounded like an argument. As the afternoon continued, I found additional emails that carried the same tone. Thomas kept asking questions. Richard kept avoiding them. By early evening, I had started keeping notes of my own. One page contained a list of names. Another contained dates. A third contained transactions that Thomas appeared particularly interested in. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. At some point, Thomas stopped acting like a business partner and started acting like an investigator. That realization unsettled me. I wasn't reading the records of a man quietly managing investments. I was reading the records of someone trying to understand something that didn't make sense. Just before dinner, my phone rang. It was David. He had spent most of the day reviewing the account records and researching Blackstone Ridge online. According to him, information about the company was surprisingly difficult to find. There were references to projects and property holdings, but very little information about the people running it. Then he mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. One of the companies connected to Blackstone Ridge shared an address with a consulting firm. At first, that detail meant nothing to me. Then, David mentioned the firm's name. I recognized it immediately. Several years earlier, my son-in-law Mark had worked there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wasn't accusing Mark of anything. In fact, I wasn't even sure the connection mattered. Large companies interact with consultants all the time. Still, the coincidence stayed with me. After hanging up, I found myself thinking about Emily and Mark. They had been married for nearly 15 years and seemed happy. Mark was intelligent, successful, and well-respected. I couldn't imagine him being involved in anything dishonest. Yet I also couldn't ignore the fact that Thomas had spent years collecting records, asking questions, and documenting transactions connected to the same network of companies. That night, I returned to the filing cabinet one final time before bed. Near the back of one drawer, I found a thin folder labeled personal. The contents were different from everything else I had reviewed. There were no contracts, no financial statements, no property records. Instead, there were handwritten notes. Most appeared to be reminders Thomas had written to himself. One page immediately caught my attention. Across the top, he had written a single question. Who can I still trust? I sat there staring at those words for a long time. The question didn't sound like something a businessman would write after reviewing investment records. It sounded like something a worried man would write after discovering something he wished he hadn't learned. For the first time since finding the account, I began wondering whether Thomas's secrecy had less to do with protecting money and more to do with protecting people. I just didn't know who he believed needed protection. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the note I found in Thomas's personal folder. Who can I still trust? Out of everything I had discovered so far, those 5 words bothered me the most. The account records explained the money. The business documents explained Blackstone Ridge. Even the arguments with Richard Kane, at least, gave me some idea of what Thomas had been dealing with during the final years of his life. But that question was different. It sounded personal. It sounded lonely. Most of all, it sounded like something written by a man who no longer knew who was on his side. I spent the next several days reviewing every document I could find. The more I read, the more obvious it became that Thomas's concerns had grown steadily over time. The earliest records focused on business operations, investment performance, and property acquisitions. The later records focused on transactions, missing documentation, and unexplained transfers between companies. Something had changed. I just didn't know what. By Thursday afternoon, I decided I needed professional help. I contacted a business attorney in Louisville named Charles Whitfield. Several years earlier, he had handled a real estate issue for a friend of mine, and she spoke highly of him. The following week, I met him in his office. The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. I brought copies of the account records, the company documents, the emails between Thomas and Richard, and several of Thomas's handwritten notes. Charles spent most of that time reading. Occasionally, he would underline something or place a sticky note on a page. For long stretches, he didn't say much at all. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and asked a question. Had Thomas ever told you why he stopped actively participating in company management? I told him I didn't even know he had been participating in company management. Charles nodded slowly. Then he pointed to several meeting records. According to the documents, Thomas gradually stepped away from leadership responsibilities during the final years of his involvement with Blackstone Ridge. His ownership remained intact, but his direct participation decreased significantly. At first glance, that didn't seem unusual. People retire. People reduce workloads. People shift priorities. But Charles wasn't focused on what Thomas did. He was focused on when he did it. The timing matched almost perfectly with the period when Thomas began documenting questionable transactions. That observation stayed with me long after I left the office. When I arrived home, I immediately returned to the filing cabinet. This time, I focused on dates. For hours, I compared meeting records, emails, financial statements, and handwritten notes. Eventually, a pattern emerged. The same names kept appearing around the same transactions. Richard Kane appeared constantly. Several executives appeared repeatedly. And one other name showed up more often than I expected. Mark Harper, my son-in-law. The discovery made me uncomfortable. Not because it proved anything. Because it didn't. The records simply showed that Mark attended meetings, participated in consulting projects, and communicated with company leadership. On its own, none of that was suspicious. Still, I couldn't ignore how often his name appeared. Later that evening, Emily called. The conversation began normally enough. We talked about her children, her work, and plans for an upcoming family gathering. Then she asked whether I had been spending a lot of time going through Thomas's papers. The question surprised me. I told her I had. She hesitated before speaking again. Then she asked whether I had found anything unusual. The question itself wasn't strange. Her tone was. I couldn't quite explain it. It sounded less like curiosity and more like concern. For a brief moment, I considered telling her everything. The account, the company, the records, the questions Thomas had been asking. Instead, I simply said that I was still trying to understand some of Thomas's business affairs. Emily seemed relieved by that answer. At least that's how it sounded to me. After we hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about the conversation. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Not because I distrusted Emily. I didn't. What bothered me was the possibility that other people might already know what I had discovered. The following afternoon, that concern became much harder to ignore. A certified letter arrived at my house. The sender was a law firm in Lexington. The letter stated that they represented Richard Kane. My hands felt cold as I read it. According to the letter, Mr. Kane wished to discuss matters related to Blackstone Ridge Holdings and Thomas's estate. The tone remained professional throughout, but one fact stood out immediately. Richard knew Thomas was gone. Richard knew I existed. And for some reason, Richard wanted to speak with me now. That timing didn't feel accidental. For 15 years, nobody had contacted me about Blackstone Ridge. Then I discovered the account. A few weeks later, Richard Kane's attorneys were asking for a meeting. I called Charles immediately. After reviewing the letter, he agreed to attend any meeting with me. His reaction also confirmed something I had already begun suspecting. Richard Kane wasn't worried about me. He was worried about what Thomas might have left behind. A few days later, Charles and I met Richard's attorney in downtown Lexington. The attorney introduced himself, exchanged pleasantries, and spent the first half hour discussing routine business matters. Then the conversation shifted. He started asking questions about Thomas's records. Had I found personal notes? Had I discovered company documents? Had Thomas left behind correspondence related to Blackstone Ridge? The questions seemed carefully designed. The attorney wasn't trying to learn what I knew. He was trying to learn how much evidence existed. The distinction mattered. As soon as the meeting ended, Charles looked at me and said something I still remember clearly. He told me that nobody spends that much effort looking for documents unless they're afraid of what's written inside them. A week later, we received confirmation that changed everything. After reviewing the materials I had provided, Charles hired a forensic accountant to examine several transactions Thomas had flagged years earlier. The findings were disturbing. Millions of dollars appeared to have moved through a network of consulting firms and shell companies over an extended period of time. The money didn't simply disappear. It went somewhere. And according to the accountant's preliminary report, many of those transactions led back to companies connected to Richard Kane. What worried me even more was that another familiar name appeared throughout the records. Mark Harper. For the first time, I found myself wondering whether the connection David discovered earlier had been more than a coincidence. I still hoped there was an innocent explanation. But with every new document, that hope became a little harder to hold on to. By the time the forensic accountant completed his preliminary review, I had stopped hoping for simple explanations. I wasn't jumping to conclusions. I wasn't assuming guilt. But I had spent enough weeks reviewing Thomas's records to understand that the same names kept appearing for a reason. Richard Kane appeared everywhere. And increasingly, so did Mark. Charles called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked whether I could come to his office the following morning. His tone wasn't dramatic, but I could tell something important had happened. When I arrived, several folders were spread across the conference table. Charles began by explaining that the forensic accountant had tracked a series of transactions spanning almost 8 years. The money moved through multiple consulting firms before eventually reaching companies connected to Blackstone Ridge executives. The process was complicated by design. Every transfer looked legitimate when viewed individually. The problem appeared when thousands of transactions were examined together. Patterns emerged. The same companies received money repeatedly. The same approvals appeared repeatedly. The same individuals benefited repeatedly. According to Charles, investigators often encounter situations like this. A single transaction rarely reveals much. Hundreds of transactions often reveal everything. For the next 2 hours, he walked me through the findings. Several consulting firms billed Blackstone Ridge for services that appeared difficult to verify. Some companies shared mailing addresses. Others shared executives. A few existed only on paper. When the accountant mapped the relationships between them, the network became impossible to ignore. Richard Kane sat near the center of almost every major connection. Mark's name appeared far less frequently, but often enough to raise serious questions. As difficult as that was to hear, the next discovery bothered me even more. The records showed that Thomas had identified many of these same issues years earlier. In some cases, his handwritten notes matched the accountant's conclusions almost exactly. That realization hit me harder than I expected. For years, Thomas had been trying to understand what was happening. For years, nobody listened. Now people were finally reviewing the evidence, and much of what he suspected appeared to be correct. After the meeting, I drove directly to Emily's house. I hadn't planned to. In fact, I spent most of the drive arguing with myself about whether I should go at all. Part of me wanted to protect her. Part of me felt she deserved to know what was happening. Eventually, the second part won. Emily answered the door looking surprised. I rarely visited without calling first. We sat at her kitchen table while her children were at school and Mark was at work. For several minutes, neither of us knew where to begin. Then I told her the truth. Not every detail. Not every document. But enough. I explained the account. I explained Blackstone Ridge. I explained Thomas's concerns. Most importantly, I explained that Mark's name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Emily listened quietly. She didn't become angry. She didn't defend him immediately. Instead, she looked confused. Then, she said something I wasn't expecting. She admitted that Mark had been acting differently for nearly 2 years. At first, she thought it was work-related stress. He spent more time on the phone. He became protective of certain business records. He occasionally disappeared for meetings he didn't want to discuss. None of those things seemed significant at the time. Now she wasn't so sure. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. By the time I left, Emily looked emotionally exhausted. Honestly, so did I. Neither of us wanted to believe Mark was involved in anything dishonest. Unfortunately, wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. 2 weeks later, the situation escalated dramatically. Federal investigators contacted Charles. The records from Thomas's files had been compared against financial documents obtained through subpoenas. The overlap was substantial. Several transactions Thomas highlighted years earlier had now been independently verified. The investigation expanded almost immediately. Additional records were requested. Former employees were interviewed. Business accounts were examined in greater detail. Then Richard Kane made a mistake. A significant one. His attorneys submitted financial records intended to support one of their arguments regarding company ownership and consulting expenses. Unfortunately for them, the records contradicted documents Thomas preserved years earlier. The discrepancy wasn't small. It involved millions of dollars. Once investigators discovered the conflict, they started looking more closely at everything surrounding it. More records surfaced. Additional witnesses came forward. People who had remained silent suddenly became willing to talk. The pressure was building, not only on Richard, on everyone connected to him, including Mark. About a month later, Emily called me late one evening. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard her voice. She had confronted Mark. At first, he denied everything. Then he admitted some involvement. Then he changed his explanation again. The details shifted each time she asked questions. What never changed was the fact that he couldn't provide a clear answer. That alone told her more than she wanted to know. By the end of the conversation, Emily was crying. Not because she understood everything, because she no longer trusted the person she had spent 15 years married to. Listening to my daughter struggle through that realization was one of the hardest moments of my life. I kept thinking about Thomas. I kept thinking about that question written in his notes. Who can I still trust? For the first time, I believed I understood why he wrote it. A few days later, federal investigators requested another meeting. This time, the discussion wasn't about missing money. It wasn't about consulting firms. It wasn't even about Richard Kane. The focus had shifted. Investigators now believed certain individuals had actively concealed records, altered documentation, and warned others whenever scrutiny increased. In other words, they weren't just investigating financial misconduct anymore. They were investigating efforts to hide it. And according to the evidence gathered so far, Mark's role appeared larger than anyone originally believed. As I left that meeting, I realized something that had taken months to accept. The questions Thomas spent years asking were finally being answered. The problem was that every answer seemed to bring more pain with it. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. For a long time, I had believed the worst thing that could happen to a family was losing someone you love. What I learned during those months was that grief isn't always caused by death. Sometimes grief comes from discovering that a person you trusted isn't who you thought they were. Emily was living through that realization every day. After confronting Mark, she moved into a small rental home with the children while she tried to decide what to do next. Some days she sounded angry. Other days she sounded heartbroken. Most days she sounded exhausted. I spent as much time with her as I could. Not because I had answers. Because she was my daughter. Sometimes people don't need answers. They simply need someone willing to sit beside them while they work through the pain. Meanwhile, the investigation continued moving forward. The more records investigators obtained, the clearer the picture became. What Thomas had suspected for years was now supported by documents, emails, bank records, and witness testimony. Millions of dollars had been moved through consulting firms and shell companies connected to Blackstone Ridge. The transactions were designed to look legitimate, but when viewed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Richard Kane remained at the center of it all. For years, he had operated with the confidence of someone who believed he would never be challenged. According to investigators, that confidence began disappearing once former employees started cooperating. People who had remained silent suddenly found reasons to speak. People who once protected Richard began protecting themselves instead. And once that process started, it accelerated quickly. Several months later, formal charges were announced. The news appeared on television, in newspapers, and across local websites. Friends started calling. Neighbors started asking questions. Even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted updates. I avoided most of those conversations. After everything that had happened, I had no interest in public attention. I simply wanted the truth to come out. The legal proceedings lasted far longer than I expected. There were hearings, motions, depositions, and endless delays. Some weeks it felt as though nothing was happening at all. Then, suddenly, a new filing or witness statement would move everything forward again. Throughout that process, one thing never changed. The evidence Thomas preserved remained central to the case. Every time investigators uncovered new records, they seemed to confirm something he had documented years earlier. I often found myself wishing he could see it. Not because he cared about being right. Because for so many years, he carried the burden alone. Now people finally understood why. The turning point came when several former Blackstone Ridge employees agreed to testify. Their accounts matched records found in Thomas's files almost perfectly. They described pressure to approve questionable transactions, instructions to avoid documenting certain decisions, and efforts to keep information away from auditors and regulators. For the first time, the case was no longer built solely on paperwork. It was supported by people willing to explain what had happened from the inside. Eventually, Richard Kane accepted a plea agreement. When I heard the news, I felt surprisingly little satisfaction. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't relieved. Mostly, I was tired. The situation had consumed nearly 2 years of my life. By that point, I cared less about punishment and more about closure. Mark's situation took longer to resolve. Unlike Richard, he continued insisting that he had never fully understood what was happening. Some of that may have been true. Some of it may not have been. Ultimately, the courts reached their own conclusions based on the evidence. What mattered most to me wasn't the outcome of his case. It was Emily. After months of difficult conversations, She made the decision to file for divorce. I won't pretend it was easy. It wasn't. There were days when she questioned herself. There were days when she wanted to believe things could return to the way they had been before. But trust is difficult to rebuild once it's broken. Eventually, she accepted what I had accepted months earlier. The truth hurts, but living with lies hurts more. About a year after the investigation concluded, life finally began feeling normal again. The account remained intact. The trust Thomas created remained protected. The legal battles were over. For the first time in a very long time, I had space to think about something other than documents, lawyers, and investigations. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the garden Thomas loved so much. The roses were blooming. The same roses he planted years earlier. As I sat there, I thought about everything that had happened. The account, the company, the secrets, the betrayal, the questions that consumed nearly 2 years of my life. Most of all, I thought about Thomas. For a while, I struggled with the fact that he kept so much hidden from me. I wanted to be angry. Sometimes I was. But as time passed, I began seeing things differently. Thomas wasn't trying to deceive me. He was trying to protect me. The account wasn't created because he wanted a secret life. The records weren't preserved because he enjoyed keeping secrets. He knew something was wrong. He spent years trying to understand it. And when he realized how serious it had become, he did everything he could to make sure his family would be safe if he wasn't there to protect us himself. That understanding changed everything for me. The $41 million certainly changed my financial future. I was able to pay off debts, help my children, support causes that mattered to me, and live without worrying about money. But the money wasn't the most valuable thing Thomas left behind. The most valuable thing was the truth. Because the truth gave me something I didn't realize I had lost. It gave me trust in my own judgment again. For years after Thomas died, I felt uncertain about everything. I doubted decisions. I questioned memories. I second-guessed myself constantly. Finding those records forced me to confront difficult realities, but it also reminded me that ignoring problems doesn't make them disappear. Sometimes the hardest answers are the ones we need most. Today, life is much quieter. Emily is doing well. My grandchildren are growing faster than I would like. David still calls every Sunday afternoon. The garden still needs more work than I want to admit. And every now and then, when I'm sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I think about the day I walked into that bank expecting to close an old account. I thought I was finishing a small piece of unfinished business. Instead, I uncovered a hidden fortune, learned the truth about the burden my husband carried for years, and discovered just how far he was willing to go to protect the people he loved. If you enjoyed spending this time with me, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link below. Supporting the channel is never expected, but it is always appreciated. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and I hope you take good care of yourselves until next time.